So we are ready. Dear Professor, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure and honor to welcome you to Professor Anne Peters' lecture on the Russian invasion of Ukraine and anti-constitutional moment international law. We are honored by the presence of Professor Anne Peters at our faculty and university. She is a highly respected specialist in international law. Professor Peters is director of the Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public Law and International Law in Heidelberg, professor at the universities of Heidelberg, Berlin, Basel, and L. Bates Lea Global Law Professor at the Law School of the University of Michigan. She's a member of the Permanent Court of Arbitration and an associate member of the Institut de Droit International. Her current research interests include public international law, including its history, global animal law, global governance and global constitutionalism, and the status of humans in international law. Today's lecture is organized with the support of the city of Poznań as part of the Akademicki Poznań program and in cooperation with the Krzysztofa Skubiszewskiego Foundation. It's also part of a series of Professor Krzysztof Skubiszewski lectures at the Faculty of Law and Administration, Adama Mickiewicza University, which aim to promote knowledge of important and topical issues in international affairs, including legal aspects. Professor Skubiszewski was a former professor of our faculty and a former Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Poland. We meet today at this difficult time and the struggle of the Ukrainian people for their freedom and for the values they defend for the sake of democracy and democratic world for all. Determination of the nation of Ukraine to stop the Russian aggression deserves great respect and admiration and makes us believe that the victory is very close. However, this victory will also mean the need to rebuild and develop the country, to restore the Ukrainian economy and its infrastructure, as well as many other elements essential for the effective functioning of the state. It's also important to reflect on the responsibility of the aggressor for violating the norms of international law and starting a war. War is an evil that spreads throughout the world, triggering further conflicts in every corner of our beautiful world. In concluding my speech, I would like to take this opportunity to thank all those who took part in organizing today's event, in particular Professor Zdzisław Kędzia, Dr. Agata Hauser, and Ms. Marta Orchowska. Bardzo dziękuję. Thank you very much. Professor, the floor is yours, but I think that first is Professor Dr. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dean. Ladies and gentlemen, we are very happy that we can come back to our tradition of Professor Skubiszewski's lectures at our faculty after a long COVID break. For those of you who don't know, the students, Professor Skubiszewski was a very important person for the Department of International Law, and we are treating him as our professor to this day, even if, we have not met them. But because we have so many students here, I have asked my professor, Professor Zdzisław Kędzia, to say a few words about the history of cooperation between our faculty, our university, and the Max Planck Institute, headed by Professor Peters. Professor Kędzia is very sorry he cannot be here with us. He has contracted COVID, but he prepared a letter, so with your permission, I'll read it now to you. Dear Professor Peters, ladies and gentlemen, I ask Dr. Hauser to convey to you, Professor Peters, and all participants my deep regrets for not being able to attend today's lecture because, as the doctor told me, I am a COVID generator. However, as you know, requests for favors usually don't go unpunished, even in the case of such benevolent people as Dr. Hauser. She instructed me to write a few words myself, which I am doing with real pleasure. Professor Peters, I am delighted that you have found time on your busy agenda to come to Poznań to present your lecture on such an important topic. Many years ago, our faculty decided to honor the memory and achievements of its outstanding professor, the architect of the foreign policy of independent Poland, by organizing Professor Krzysztof Skubiszewski lectures. Considering, among other things, his long-standing friendly cooperation with German academic centers, our faculty invited inter alia Professor Bruno Ziemer of Munich, a judge of the International Court of Justice, to inaugurate the series. Let me say that I see some remarkable symbolism in the fact that Professor Peters of Heidelberg is restarting this series of lectures after the COVID break. Professor Kenja continues, "It is good when neighbors visit each other. It is good when neighbors cooperate. It is good when neighbors are friends." The arrival of Professor Peters in Poznań is embedded in the long-standing cooperation between public lawyers from Germany and Poland. Already in the early 1970s, Professor Rudolf Bernhard, director of the Max Planck Institute, Ingo von Münk from Hamburg, Joost Delbrück from Kiel, Peter Badura from Munich, together with the director of the Institute of Legal Studies of the Polish Academy of Sciences, Professor Adam Mickiewicza, as well as Professor Krzysztof Skubiszewski, initiated a series of scholarly colloquia that were held on a biannual basis, alternately in Germany and in Poland, including in Poznań. And this tradition continued until late 80s. Many research projects were born out of this platform. I found that particularly gratifying. However, what was important was a sense of human bonding, mutual trust, respect, and simply friendship that arose from these contacts. This is one of the foundation stones upon which to build our neighborly cooperation, direct and EU-wide, and to make it resilient against destructive attempts such as those made by ruling forces in our country over the past 8 years. I cannot refrain from a personal thread. In recognition of her outstanding scientific achievements and skills, Professor Peters was appointed director of one of the world's most prestigious research institutions, the Max Planck Institute in Heidelberg. I am greatly indebted to this institution and my tutor, Professor Bernhard, for hosting me on research stays and supporting me in my research. Sometimes old hits lose their allure, but to my ears, "Ich habe mein Herz in Heidelberg verloren" still sounds touching. Professor Peters, I wish you satisfaction with your lecture and good memories of Poznań. Zdzisław Dzidek. Kenja, Professor, allow me to present you a copy of that letter. I have nothing to add except for the fact that we are extremely happy to have you here today with us and are looking forward to your presentation. Professor, you have the floor.
Yeah, dear family Skubiszewski, dear colleagues, friends, and students, I feel overwhelmed by these words. So, I just can't tell how touched I am. Actually, when I suggested the title of this lecture in honor of Krzysztof Skubiszewski, this was before the 7th October of this year. But speaking today, I feel that I simply cannot leave out the other war between Israel and Hamas. And I would therefore like to start with the following quote by Krzysztof Skubiszewski. I quote him, "Self-determination creates a responsibility not only for those who are directly concerned." Judge Skubiszewski wrote this in his dissenting opinion to the ICJ judgment in the East Timor case, but I think we should listen to him when we respond to this war. So it's really an enormous honor for me to stand here, and as Agatha Hauser and the Dean already mentioned, Professor Skubiszewski was a close collaborator and maybe even, I think, a friend of the Max Planck Institute. He was not only a founder and regular participant in the colloquia that you mentioned, but he also wrote an entry on the topic International Legislation in the Max Planck Encyclopedia of International Law, which was at that time edited by the late director Rudolf Bernhard. Skubiszewski was, of course, at the peak of his international career when the Soviet Union was still firmly in place. But today still, I think that Russia and this war deeply and existentially affects Poland, affects us for various reasons that you probably know much better than me. And therefore, I thought that the Russian aggression might be a suitable topic for this lecture here in Poznan. On 24th February 2022, the German Chancellor called out a Zeitenwende, an epochal change. The Russian invasion in its sovereign neighbor state, Ukraine, violated, as you all know, one of the basic principles of international law, the prohibition on the use of force and of aggression. And this triggered a classic interstate war, something that had been thought to be a thing of the past. And in my lecture today, I want to analyze whether and to what extent the war in Ukraine indeed has a systemic, one could say a constitutional significance for the legal order as a whole. And I will single out 3 legal developments. The one concerning the first principle and pillar of peace, for whose maintenance the United Nations Security Council has been entrusted with the primary responsibility, to quote the UN Charter. The second legal developments concern the legal status of the individual human being. And both themes lie in the core of the current international legal order, and that's why I would call them constitutional themes. Both themes actually lie also in the center of the work of Krzysztof Skubiszewski. My thesis in this lecture is that although Russia has breached a constitutional principle of international law, the prohibition of interstate military force, this breach has productively, though unintended, triggered 2 important legal developments that go to the very heart of international law. Moreover, there is a third trend, and that is the greening of both the law surrounding war and the law on the status of the individual. So with some optimism, the Russian invasion can be seen not only as anti-constitutional, but at the same time also as a constitutional moment. And at this point, I must explain what I mean by constitutional moment. Of course, this makes sense only in a paradigm of global constitutionalism, which is, as an ism, both a positive analysis and a normative agenda concerning international law. The positive analysis, the description, lies in reading and reconstructing some features and functions of international law in its interplay with domestic law as forming constitutional bits and pieces and as reflecting some constitutionalist principles. You will agree with me that the international legal order as a whole pursues 2 objectives: safeguarding peace and safeguarding human dignity. And these objectives, these goals, translate into fundamental constitutional principles, namely the prohibition of the use of force and the protection of international human rights. And therefore, we can imagine international law as resting on 2 pillars: those institutions that seek to secure peace and the rules and procedures that protect the human being. And additionally, I identify a third objective and a third pillar, and that is safeguarding our planet. The simple reason is that without such an ecological third pillar, the first and the second pillar would completely break down. So what would Krzysztof Skubiszewski say on this framing of international law? In the Festschrift for Hermann Mosler, who was a former director of the Max Planck Institute, Skubiszewski made a contribution on the interpretation of the United Nations Charter that was already in 1983. And here he wrote, I quote, "The meaning of the word constitution changes when transposed from the domestic to the international scene. It does not automatically carry with it the introduction of domestic patterns into the interpretation of the law of international organizations." End of quote. On the other hand, Skubiszewski did not uphold a strict separation between the international and domestic law. He recognized that these bodies interact. Finally, Skubiszewski also espoused natural law. I quote him, "Natural law lies at the origin of at least some of the rules of jus cogens. The case in point is human rights. In its essential part, positive law on human rights is dictated by natural law. However, there is interaction between these two types of laws. End of quote. So the idea that there is a body of international law in its interaction with domestic law that is so fundamental that these rules deserve the label global constitutional law, and that is also associated with the idea of jus cogens, and also with the idea of a positivized natural law. These ideas, I think, can be found in Skubiszewski's writing. And that allows me to believe that Skubiszewski is being open to the idea of global constitutionalism. So I hope that he might be interested in this lecture today. So my question is, has the Russian invasion of 24th February 2022 been an anti-constitutional moment? Here I borrow from Bruce Ackerman's theory of constitutional moments in the constitutional history of the United States of America. By constitutional moment, Ackerman referred to the extraordinary political situations in which, without any formal legal reform, new constitutional principles emerge that later become accepted and entrenched. This lens has also been applied to historical breaks in European history. For example, the dissolution of the Socialist Bloc in 1989 has also been qualified as such a constitutional moment. A parallel concept in international law is the concept of a Grotian moment, named after the father of international law, Hugo Grotius. Grotian moments are rapid crystallizations of new rules and doctrines of customary international law. Especially the Nuremberg trials of 1946 have been characterized as a Grotian moment, also in legal practice. Allow me to cite the famous passage of the Nuremberg judgment. I quote, "It was submitted that international law is concerned with the actions of sovereign states and provides no punishment for individuals. In the opinion of the tribunal, that international law imposes duties and liabilities upon individuals as well as upon states has long been recognized. Crimes against international law are committed by men, not by abstract entities, and only by punishing individuals who commit such crimes can the provisions of international law be enforced." End of quote of the Nuremberg Tribunal. So here, in this prototypical Grotian moment of 1946, the idea of direct duties of individuals under international law, even to the extent of attracting criminal penalty, was announced. And as a flip side of a constitutional moment such as Nuremberg, I qualify the sudden breakdown of core norms of international law as an anti-constitutional moment. So how can these concepts be applied to the Russian aggression? My hypothesis is that, although Russia has clearly violated the use of force, and although Putin and his troika have presumably committed the crime of aggression, the responses by the international community have led to a confirmation of the underlying principles and have even given rise to new legal developments. Let me elaborate on the systemic significance of the Russian legal breaches. First of all, Putin declared a war not only against Ukraine, but explicitly against the West as such. Secondly, Russia employed the language of international law to defend its course of action. Putin, in his speech that was annexed to the Russian letter to the Security Council, relied on self-defense, on invitation by the so-called republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. He also pointed to the need to protect Russian citizens against human rights violations. So what does this mean for the value and for the validity of the basic norm, the prohibition of the use of force, that was breached by Russia? Actually, the prohibition of the use of military force has been breached many times before. It has also been declared a dead letter many times. for example, after the unlawful invasion of the United States into Iraq in 2003. So has the prohibition on the use of force now definitely been killed by the Russian invasion? Well, not every violation of international law leads to its weakening. Breaches of the law, non-compliance, are a normal fact of legal life. So the question is, when do the violations lead to norm erosion, and when, on the contrary, have breaches, under invocation of legal justifications, the contrary effect of confirming or maybe even strengthening the underlying rules of international law? There is scholarship in the field of international relations that has identified so-called norm contestation as a productive force for the development of international law. Christian Marxen has further developed this idea of norm contestation to distinguish between different scenarios. He calls it applicatory contestation. These are disputes about the application of a rule. Legislative contestation are violations of the law with the intention to develop the law. And finally, there is systemic contestation or deep contestation, which seeks to shatter the rule, or with which the violator steps outside the legal framework. When we apply these models to the Russian invasion, we see that Russia's law talk constituted an abuse of the language of international law, as the German Society of International Law put it in its statement on the events. The Russian legal explanations were neither by states nor by scholars recognized as defensible legal arguments. They did not pass what scholar Thomas Frank once called the laugh test. They were merely a cynical employment of words to veil a blatantly unlawful conduct. And the result was that the majority of states rejected the so-called legal arguments. The conduct was condemned and this was underlined by sanctions, and a scholarly consensus against the argument emerged. All this points to a legally untenable, to an undefensible claim. And applying these criteria, we can indeed say that Russia's legal arguments to justify its war against Ukraine are, as commentators put it, demonstrably rubbish justifications. They are just bullshit. The Russian aggression must therefore, despite its lip service to international law, be qualified as a systemic contestation. Russia turned against existing international law. It advocates for an international order that deviates significantly in its basic orientation from the existing order. Russia seems to advocate for a framework in which other states within Russia's sphere of influence do not enjoy a right to sovereign equality. This paradigm resembles the Brezhnev doctrine of Cold War. Russia seems to advocate a Großraumordnung, a hegemonial sphere in the sense of Carl Schmitt. So indeed, we here see an anti-constitutional moment in international law. However, this Russian attempt to overturning the international constitutional principle of non-use of force has so far not been accepted by other states. In the General Assembly of the United Nations, the vast majority of states has condemned the Russian invasion, and a smaller majority also supports the sanctions. But as we know, the mainly Western sanctions are undermined seriously by powerful state actors such as China and India, and by several Central Asian states. I now come to the point of reconstitution, if you follow the handout. And this is the other side. The Russian aggression pushed long-standing efforts to curtail the veto towards a procedural reform. This is a kind of a modest reconstitution that strengthens the pillar of peace-preserving law. 2 months after the Russian invasion in Ukraine, the UN General Assembly adopted the so-called veto initiative. Under this General Assembly resolution, the President of the General Assembly must convene a formal meeting And there is a standing mandate to publicly discuss and criticize each and every veto in the General Assembly. This procedure was triggered in June 2022 with a General Assembly debate on the vetoes cast by Russia and China on a draft Security Council resolution on nuclear tests by North Korea. In this debate, numerous states from all the world regions made explicit and very positive statements on the new procedure. At least 11 states qualified this debate as historic, as a milestone, or as a landmark. 16 states found that the new mechanism would enhance the transparency and accountability of the Security Council. Others saw an improvement of the effectiveness and efficiency of the Council. Especially Liechtenstein, that was the state that had sponsored this initiative, Liechtenstein expressed its hope that the prospects of accountability to the General Assembly will lead to more Security Council action and to fewer vetoes being cast. So many states welcomed the empowerment and the vital role of the General Assembly. According to Eurogray, a turning point in the relationship between the Council and the Assembly was reached. Only Syria criticized the new formula, standing debate in the General Assembly, and deplored a political polarization. However, this mechanism that was so celebrated did not seem to deploy any tangible effect with regard to the war regarding Gaza. I looked it up and saw that at least 2 draft resolutions had been tabled, but they failed because of the exercise of the veto of the United States on the one hand, and the other draft resolution tabled by the United States was vetoed by China and Russia. But as far as I saw, there was no substantive debate in the General Assembly. So I had the impression that the legal and political effects of this new procedure in the General Assembly remain to be seen still. And importantly, of course, this purely procedural move under the new General Assembly resolution does not address the substance of the veto power, and it does not address the root cause of the discomfort with the veto power, namely that this veto power does not reflect contemporary geopolitical realities. Unsurprisingly, emerging states such as Brazil and India have voiced some skepticism against the new procedure. Russia, not without merit, pointed out that the veto remains a necessary device to prevent the adoption of resolutions on military action without the support of states that are willing and able to actually deploy military action. Without such support, these decisions would be mere paper tigers and would destroy the authority of the Security Council. Therefore, the question remains which normative and factual power actually lies in such procedures. The twin objectives of the veto initiative are to deter the use of the veto and to create accountability. Deterrence might result from the slight increase of the costs of exercising the veto, and these costs are the shaming effect of the broad and public debate. Putting veto users under the spotlight in the General Assembly generates transparency, and transparency is in itself a mild form of accountability. Generally speaking, the obligation to explain and to give reasons forces a decision maker, in our case the veto power, to base its acts on claims regarding the general interest, rather than on selfish appeals. And this has been called the civilizing force of hypocrisy. Reasons given, even if they may be hypocritical, still have the consequence of generating better outcomes, because in an official debate, the bad reasons cannot be stated. The obligation to explain before the General Assembly leaves the exercise of the veto within the realm of discretion of the permanent member of the Security Council, but it still forces the state to rationalize somehow the exercise of the veto right. And this then allows other states and also the public to criticize these reasons. So on the long run, the necessity to justify the veto might lead to ruling out the most blatant abuses that simply cannot be rationalized. Now, importantly, this reform did not require an amendment of the UN Charter. It can be legally framed as a dynamic interpretation of the Charter through subsequent practice. What would Skubiszewski have said on this? Although Skubiszewski had cautioned against the constitutional paradigm, he also wrote in 1983, I quote, that it cannot be denied that the constitutional nature of the treaty, and here he meant the UN Charter, has an influence on its interpretation. Now, the constitutional style of interpretation is normally said to be a bit more dynamic, with constitutions being living instruments, to borrow the famous phrase of the US Supreme Court. However, Skubiszewski was careful not to confuse dynamic interpretation with amendment. I quote, obviously, the perception of the Charter as a constitution does not entail the power to extend, alter, or disregard its provisions under the guise of interpretation, wrote Skubiszewski. So resolutions such as the veto initiative may only, according to Skubiszewski, amount to an interpretive agreement in the sense of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties if all member states have expressed their agreement. In contrast, the practice of only some member states, even if expressed through a United Nations organ in a valid resolution, is nothing more than practice of those states and of the organ concerned. It is not equivalent, wrote Skubiszewski, to subsequent conduct of the parties, end of the quote. I think that this view is quite sovereigntist, I would say, and it has, in the last 50 years, been, I submit, overtaken by practice, which now also counts the practice of the organs of an international organization themselves, so in this case, the practice of the United Nations General Assembly, as a creator of relevant practice. So far for the first pillar of peace. I now turn to the second pillar of a constitutionalizing international legal order, and this second pillar is humanity, the dignity and the inviolability of humans. I submit that in a fully constitutionalized international legal order, the individual human being should be the primary normative reference point and should be recognized as the natural person also of international law. In fact, since the 1990s, the doctrines of international human rights have been more and more refined, so that human rights now permeate the entire field of international law. This means that each and every special rule must be interpreted in the light of human rights, and that human rights impact assessments and human rights due diligence must be conducted. Human rights often operate as a counterforce, for example, against free trade, against foreign investment, against resource extraction, or in international finance law. In other regimes, human rights function to reinforce the legal rules, such as in the fields of development cooperation, in international environmental law, in climate law, and biodiversity law. Skubiszewski noted in 2007 that, I quote, this rich lawmaking activity was so broad that some parts of it became known as having given birth to new human rights, or even to their new generations. But Skubiszewski firmly insists that some of these, what he called man-made human rights, and here he particularly meant social rights, are also essential. However, Skubiszewski did not anticipate new rights such as the right to the city or the right to erasure in the internet, to name only a few new rights. 15 years later, since Skubiszewski wrote that, human rights suffer from a broad and deepened ideational critique, which goes far beyond the classic cultural relativist objection against human rights. That was the critique that human rights are only a crusade of the West against the rest. Critics today speak of rights inflation, of rights proliferation, of rights overreach, of an undue right-ing of and in international law. And this renewed theoretical critique against human rights spans all ideational camps, from neo-Marxism over populism to neoliberalism and conservative originalism. To conclude, there is an unholy alliance against human rights. And against this background, it is highly interesting that, far from weakening the legal status of humans in international law, the Russian aggression has given additional momentum to the humanization of international law. Traditionally, the prohibitions of the use of force and of aggression had been seen to protect only the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. With this argument, the English House of Lords had still in 2008 rejected a human rights claim brought by mothers of British soldiers killed in the Iraq War of 2003. The Law Lords said that although this war violated the United Nations Charter, its illegality did not lead to a breach of the right to life of the employed soldiers. The United Kingdom had not, according to the House of Lords, violated its duties of protection and care under the European Convention on Human Rights. By contrast, the UN Human Rights Committee, in its general comment on the right to life, opined that, and I quote the committee, states parties engaged in acts of aggression as defined in international law, resulting in deprivation of life, violate ipso facto the right of life, to life, of the covenant. So, by logical extrapolation, human rights violations of this kind would not only be committed against the individuals in the victim state, an aggression in this logic would even violate the international human rights of the aggressor's state's own combatants. This reasoning, as presented by Frédéric Maigret and Chiara Redaelli, this reasoning would run even more against the grain of the traditional logic of war. Other scholars, for example, Eliav Lieblich, they are skeptical towards what he calls a creeping individualist sensibility, which seeks to place individual rights at the core of the international legal regime in its entirety. So he thinks that the novel focus on the individual in the jus contra bellum is conveying a reductive individualism. Indeed, such an individualization of war, to quote a book title by Jennifer Welsh, such an individualization of war has far-reaching repercussions. It would, for example, lead to an obligation to provide remedies to the individual victims. And this then even leads to a quest for remedies for harm and damage caused to combatants, notably those of the defending state. And this individualization also fortifies the obligation to prosecute the ongoing crime of aggression. And this is, of course, very relevant for Russia. Because Gaza is now so much on our minds, I would also like to point out how deeply this war involves the second pillar of humanity. In the monstrous terror attacks of Hamas of 7th October, many scholars argue now that this amounts to a crime against humanity. And interestingly, the rhetorics in this war also use the so-called language of dehumanization, namely denying the enemy group their humanity. The Commissioner General of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, Philip Lazzarini, he said, I quote him, an entire population of the Gaza Strip is being dehumanized. And the Israeli Defense Minister had declared on 9th October, so that was 2 days after the massacres, or I quote him, "We are fighting human animals and we are acting accordingly, end of quote. So this dehumanization seeks to justify atrocities. This only works on the premise that there is indeed a strict hierarchy between humans on top and animals below. It works as long as animals are at the very bottom and as long as they have no right to exist. And actually, psychological research has shown that a flattening of this hierarchy and an erosion of the boundary between human animals and non-human animals is actually good for humans, that it could lead to more humane behavior also towards humans. And this now leads me to the third pillar of the edifice of international law, the ecological pillar. The principle of sustainable development is a foundational, and I would also say a constitutional principle of international law. The urgent need to become more sustainable, to save the planet, the basis of our existence, is recognized by international law. All big multilateral treaties that have been negotiated in the last years are ecological treaties. The Climate Paris Agreement of 2015, the Convention on Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction as finalized in 2022, and also the current negotiations on the Plastic Pollution Treaty. Krzysztof Skubiszewski did not deal with this area of law, but I think that if he lived now to see the state of the earth, he would realize the necessity of greening international law. And importantly, such greening hooks onto the two constitutional pillars I mentioned before, the law of peace and the rights of humans. President Zelensky's peace plan, as you maybe know, contains as point number one the ecological recovery of the region. And this will, of course, be a huge task given the destruction of ecosystems and oil spill by the breaking of the Lakova Dam of the Dnieper and the contamination of the battlefield with landmines and many other problems. So let me go a bit in detail on the recent harnessing of international human rights law for protecting the environment. First, the traditional human rights to private life and bodily integrity have been activated by the regional human rights courts and by domestic courts to force states to take measures to protect the environment. This also contains climate action. Also, the pending request for an International Court of Justice advisory opinion on state obligations with regard to climate change also asks the court to analyze the obligations flowing from the UN Declaration on Human Rights. Second, a new human right to a clean and healthy environment has been recognized by the Inter-American Court on Human Rights and also by the UN General Assembly. And third, rights of elements of nature, such as rivers, volcanoes, glaciers, and animals, are being recognized by courts, mostly in Latin America and India. But the rise of rights in this context has also exposed the dark side of humanism, in this context mostly denounced as anthropocentrism. Anthropocentrism is an undue focus on humans at the expense of proper attention to the ecological sphere. In our era, the Anthropocene, with the climate catastrophe unfolding and the sixth mass extinction underway, the call to recognize the human being, the anthropos, as the normative reference point of international law has become suspect. These debates have generated calls for a post-humanist ecocentrism. And at this juncture, as mentioned, the courts and scholars who suggest that personhood and international rights should also be extended to animals and elements of nature are criticized. The critics oppose such extensions of rights and propose to the contrary that the category of personhood and the category of rights should be eliminated altogether in order to remove the primary cause for law's neglect for nature. Critical post-humanists seek to dismantle the idea that the human sits in hierarchical supremacy over other subjects, including the environment and non-humans. Post-humanist scholars recognize humankind's embeddedness within natural systems and they accept that other forms of life are morally significant. And they are convinced that the human rights-focused liberal response to the ecological challenge falls short. They seek to de-anthropocenter the response to the environmental crisis. My response here is that a human-centered approach to international law can properly address the ecological challenge if it navigates between two extremes. The extremes lead to dead ends, I think. We need to avoid both a simply backward-looking repetitive rehumanization on the one side and throwing the humans under the bus on the other side. Between these two extremes lies a middle course of what the anthropologist Iris Braverman has called more than human legalities. So a more than human international law approach would mean to critically work through the foundations of humanism and question some of the traditional premises, notably the hierarchy of humans over the rest of the world and the isolation of the single human person. So this could contribute to constructing an international legal order that responds to the overlapping ecological crisis which international society now faces. So in the end, a green and entangled humanism or a human-inclusive ecocentrism seems a promising paradigm for the international law of the future. In parallel, we need to recognize that an atomized individual personhood is also not truly representative of human personhood, which exists and can only exist within social settings. This would also do more justice to third world approaches to international law. So we need to give the individual a proper place, resituated within social structures, which themselves must be situated within the ecosystem and earth system upon which they depend. And this seems to me to be necessary for shaping international legal responses to the excesses of capitalism, to the abuses of neocolonialism, and to the environmental devastation. So it is not adequate to give up the human, be it in favor of a new statism or be it in favor of approaches that favor networks or ligatures or just simply physical matter as the school of new materialism demands. Such giving up on the human would mean to leave behind all those members of the human population for whom the era of humanization has barely begun. Let's revisit the Russian aggression. So was it an anti-constitutional or, on the contrary, a constitutional moment? I think the reactions were clear that the prohibition of the use of force has been verbally upheld by the vast majority of states, but that this is undermined by the circumvention of the sanctions. Moreover, Russia has already since 2014 deeply and systematically contested the basic principle of sovereign equality of states in its sphere of influence. Russian lip service to state sovereignty and prohibition of the use of force are mere cynical abuses of the language of the law to cover up its violations. We are therefore indeed witnessing an erosion of a core constitutional norm. On the other hand, the individual accountability of President Putin and the Troika for the crime of aggression is high on the agenda. While the ICC, the International Criminal Court, doesn't have jurisdiction, other forums are being contemplated. The same is true for the personal accountability of military superiors and of each and every soldier for the war crimes committed. So I think that the individualization of war will play out, in theory. We don't know whether and when this individual accountability will ever be realized. Finally, as I argued, the third pillar of a much more ecological international law is quickly being set up. However, I put only a house of cards with question mark on the handout. There is the danger that these pillars are not strong enough. They risk to break down like a house of cards. Under the pressure of the material conditions in the economic and military sense, these ideas and ideals, even if they are dialectically co-shaped by the material conditions, The ideas are indispensable to uphold international law. International law is in a period of challenge and change. But as you just demonstrated here in your country in Poland, such change, also to the better, can come about quickly and unexpectedly. So I think that this proved the power of ideas, even in dark times. The preamble of the United Nations organization, UNESCO, of the UNESCO Constitution, put it as follows, I quote, "Since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed." So this is what we must do, and this is also in the spirit of Krzysztof Skubiszewski. As Jerzy Makarczyk wrote in his introduction to the Liber Amicorum in honor of Skubiszewski, "It is thanks to men like him that we, the younger generation of lawyers, never lost faith in human values, in the primacy of law, both in eternal and international relations, in the indivisibility of international law." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Peters, for your lecture. So many issues, so many things to discuss. In order to facilitate the discussion, Professor Peters prepared a handout. So a detailed structure of the lecture. You can all download it if you could just scan the QR code, which is on your screens. Then you can easily remind yourselves of the structure of this lecture. However, just very briefly, the professor focused on 3 issues. First one being peace, and she analyzed the Russian aggression also from the point of view of contestation of certain norms of international law, as well as the use of veto and the new approach to veto used at the UN bodies. However, from a very practical point of view, our approach to use of force nowadays also has a strong consideration of individuals as victims of an act of aggression, possible remedies for families of soldiers, and a human rights approach to issues which were traditionally considered as merely interstate conflicts. Of course, if we add NIACs, conflicts between non-state actors, the situation becomes even more complicated. Finally, the professor presented some information regarding our planet, which is necessary for the full enjoyment of all human rights as well as for the functioning of the United Nations. She presented the post-humanist critiques regarding also the anthropocentric nature of the current system, and proposed a more than human approach that would, in a way, take into account not only humans, but all beings, without necessarily focusing on the language of human rights.